So when you hit like absolute overwhelming burnout, your brain isn't actually out of energy.
Right.
It's essentially it's a software glitch. It's your amygdala looking at this massive, terrifying scope of a goal you're trying to achieve, calculating the effort, and just preemptively choosing to cut the power.
Yes, exactly. It's a protective mechanism.
Yeah, I mean, it feels like you have absolutely nothing left in the tank, but physically, biologically speaking, the fuel is right there. The system just refuses to access it.
It's a predictive error by the brain. We tend to view burnout or, extreme fatigue as this purely mechanical failure, like a car running out of
Yep.
gas. But human endurance is just so much more complex than that. It's this constant, ongoing negotiation between the energy you actually possess and the energy your brain believes you're going to need to survive the rest of the journey.
And when that calculation tips into the red,
Yeah, your nervous system triggers this localized paralysis. You just freeze.
and breaking that exact paralysis is what we are focusing on today. So welcome to today's deep dive on this Friday, April 24th, 2026.
Glad to be here.
For you listening right now, the mission today is actually entirely unique. You submitted a piece of source material that is remarkably brief. I mean, it's an excerpt from a text titled The Resolve to Persist, and it is exactly 18 words long.
3 sentences.
Just 3 sentences.
It's highly concentrated. And what's really brilliant about it is that it operates essentially as a piece of psychological code. Like, it's designed to manually override that exact software glitch we were just talking about.
Yeah, so the text reads, and I'll just quote it here. You didn't come this far to quit. One more step, one more try, keep going.
Which is so simple.
Right? On the surface, that sounds like, I don't know, standard locker room motivation.
Yeah, like a poster on a gym wall.
Exactly. But when you look at the underlying mechanics of how it addresses cognitive overload and human friction, you realize it's actually a comprehensive framework for bypassing the brain's alarm system.
Okay, let's unpack this. Because to understand why these 18 words work, we actually have to look at why traditional motivation just entirely fails us when we're exhausted.
Right, right.
Oh.
Because when you're in the middle of a brutal project or, say, a grueling study session or a massive life transition, what is the standard advice people always give you?
Oh, it's always keep your eyes on the prize or, visualize the finish line.
Precisely. Traditional motivation is almost entirely forward-looking. It relies on pulling you towards some future reward.
Right.
But neurologically speaking, when you're already in a state of severe depletion, looking forward is basically the absolute worst thing you can do.
Wait, really? The worst thing?
Yes, because visualizing a distant finish line requires your brain to compute the massive gap between your current state of exhaustion and that final destination.
Which triggers the exact software glitch we opened with. Exactly. The amygdala perceives that gap as a massive threat to your survival, sounds the alarm, and just shuts down your motivation to protect your remaining resources.
Wow. Which brings us to the very first psychological lever in the text. It doesn't tell you to look at the finish line at all. It forces this complete, abrupt perspective shift in the opposite direction.
Yeah, you didn't come this far to quit.
It forces you to look backward at your own accumulated effort. I mean, it's weaponizing a cognitive bias, isn't it? It sounds incredibly similar to the sunk cost fallacy.
That is exactly what it's doing. It's fascinating. In behavioral economics, the sunk cost fallacy is usually a bad thing.
Right, like staying in a bad movie just because you bought the ticket.
Exactly. It's the tendency to continue investing time or money into a failing endeavor simply because you've already invested so much. Your brain hates the idea of wasting past effort.
It physically pains us.
It does. Usually this makes people hold on to bad investments or toxic relationships way too long. But here, the text actively weaponizes that exact psychological bias for your benefit.
Because it takes this intense, irrational human aversion to loss and just points it directly at your own sweat equity.
Yes. When your brain is screaming at you to quit because the future looks too hard, this framework interrupts that calculation. It reminds the brain of how much past suffering will be entirely invalidated if you stop right now.
It creates a sense of internal accountability.
Right. You're no longer trying to muster energy for some abstract future version of yourself who gets to cross a finish line. You're suddenly fighting to protect the investments of your past self.
That dramatically shifts the emotional chemistry of the moment. I mean, if I'm grinding through a massive research paper, right, and I hit a wall at 2:00 a.m.
We've all been there.
Oh, yeah. Looking forward at the 20 pages I still have to write will completely crush me. But if I turn around and audit the resilience I've already spent, the hours of reading, the late nights, the initial drafting, I suddenly realize the sheer volume of capital I've already poured into this project.
Right, so quitting isn't neutral anymore.
Exactly. Quitting is no longer just stopping. Quitting becomes this active destruction of my own past work. It transforms exhaustion into a very stubborn, almost defensive refusal to let that effort go to waste.
It creates an anchor.
Mm.
You validate your own capacity to endure by acknowledging the friction you've already survived. You realize that the version of you who started this journey essentially handed a baton to the current exhausted version of you.
Right.
And dropping it now renders all of their suffering meaningless.
And I gotta play devil's advocate here. Logically, an anchor is static. Looking backward at your sweat equity stops you from retreating, and it stops you from quitting in that specific moment, sure. But it doesn't actually generate propulsion. It doesn't tell you how to move forward when you are still completely paralyzed by the distance left to travel.
No, it doesn't, which is why relying solely on past effort is insufficient. And the text knows this. Once it establishes the anchor, it has to solve the problem of propulsion, which requires addressing the brain's processing power directly.
Which leads us to the next operational phase of the text. One more step, one more try. And wait, I have to jump in here. Doesn't one more try border on, toxic productivity?
How so?
Well, if your system is crashing and your brain is sounding the alarm that you are at your absolute limit, forcing another step usually just leads to a full physiological breakdown. How is this not just telling someone to bang their head against a brick wall until they collapse?
What's fascinating here is how it specifically circumvents that breakdown through a biological process called cognitive scope reduction.
Cognitive scope reduction.
Yes. It's not demanding superhuman strength, and it's not asking you to ignore your limits. It is fundamentally altering what your brain is actually trying to process.
Wait, walk me through the mechanics of that. How does cognitive scope reduction actually work in real time?
So think about it like the RAM in a computer trying to render a massive open-world video game.
Okay.
If the computer tries to render the entire map, every city, every forest, every NPC, all at the exact same time, the system is completely overloaded. The memory leaks, the processor overheats, and the game just crashes.
Oh, yeah, you get those massive frame drops.
Right. So to prevent the crash, the software is designed to only render the immediate environment, basically just the 5 feet in front of your character.
Which frees up all that processing power because it simply ignores the rest of the map.
Exactly. Now, when you are burned out, your prefrontal cortex, which is the logical planning part of your brain, is trying to render the entire map of your goal.
Oh, wow.
If you're launching a business, it's trying to calculate the product design, the marketing, the funding, the hiring all at once. The cognitive load is staggering, and the amygdala senses this massive energy demand, interprets it as a threat, and triggers paralysis.
So when the text says one more step, one more try, it's actively restricting the rendering engine.
It deliberately removes the ultimate goal from the equation entirely. It doesn't say finish the project. It doesn't say win the race. By isolating your action to the absolute smallest possible unit of progress, it shrinks the horizon line until the horizon is right in front of your toes.
That's incredible.
The cognitive demand drops to near zero. Your brain goes, oh, I don't need to render the whole map. I just need enough energy to move forward 3 inches. And almost anyone, no matter how profoundly exhausted, can muster the resources for one microscopic action.
I love that. And this is a perfect moment to bring this directly to you, the listener.
Right.
Because one more step is largely metaphorical depending on what you're tackling, right?
Absolutely.
And whatever you are setting or whatever deeply frustrating project you're navigating today, what is your literal equivalent of one more step? Like if you're trying to learn a new language, it's not becoming fluent today. It's not even finishing the podcast in your target language.
No, not at all.
Your one more step is just translating the very next sentence. That is it. The rest of the language doesn't exist. If you're a coder facing a massive bug, it's not fixing the whole application. It's just writing the next line of logic. You are creating a sealed compartment of time and effort.
And inside that sealed compartment, the massive weight of the future is entirely lifted. You're shifting the workload from the panicked emotional centers of the brain back to the prefrontal cortex, because the task is now perceived as highly manageable.
Right.
It's a profound hack for the human nervous system. You essentially trick your brain into committing to a fraction of a percent of the work.
And there's always a but. The reality is, one microscopic step does not finish the project.
Sure.
Translating one sentence doesn't make you fluent. So once you successfully break the paralysis by taking that microaction, you have a new problem. How do you sustain it?
Yeah, that's the real challenge.
Right, because if you have to consciously trick your brain for every single step, you're going to exhaust your cognitive reserves anyway.
That is the crucial tension. And it's precisely what the final directive of the text is engineered to resolve.
Keep going.
Yes.
Here's where it gets really interesting. Because of the stark, almost brutal simplicity of that ending, let's analyze what the text actively chooses not to say.
Okay.
It doesn't promise that you will reach the finish line after that one more try. It doesn't offer a guarantee of some shiny reward. It doesn't say one more step and then you get to rest. It simply dictates a continuous, uninterrupted state of motion. Just keep going.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, that final phrase is doing something radical to your psychology. It is profoundly redefining the metric of success.
How so?
Usually human beings define success purely by the destination, getting the degree, signing the client, hitting the target weight.
Right, the big milestones.
But when you're in the deepest part of the struggle, measuring your success by a destination that is still miles away is actively destructive. You will always feel like you are failing because you aren't there yet.
Right, because every time you measure the gap, you remind the amygdala of how far you still have to go.
Right.
And you risk triggering the paralysis all over again.
Exactly.
So if success is no longer the finish line, what does it become?
Success becomes the execution of motion. The text shifts your entire value system. It argues that in the crucible of extreme fiction, victory isn't finishing. Victory is simply moving.
Wow.
If you took one more step, you won. If you made one more try, you succeeded.
That completely alters the physics of human willpower. I mean, think about the difference between static friction and kinetic friction in physics.
Oh, that's a great way to look at it.
Right. It takes a tremendous amount of force to push a heavy object from a dead stop that is static friction. That's the hardest part. But once that object is actually sliding, it takes significantly less force to keep it moving. That's kinetic friction.
A perfect analogy. When you are paralyzed by burnout, you are fighting static friction. The one more step overcomes that initial massive resistance. But if you stop after that step to reevaluate the distance to the goal, you reset to a dead stop. You have to fight static friction all over again for the very next step.
Which is just exhausting.
Exactly. By instructing you to keep going, the text is telling you to stay in the realm of kinetic friction. It establishes this operational cadence for the mind. You chain those microactions together so seamlessly that the brain never gets a chance to stop, look up, and panic about the remaining distance.
You just inhabit a continuous state of motion.
Yes.
It's rhythmic. It's almost like a
Right.
heartbeat. Acknowledge the past, shrink the present, sustain the motion, look back. Look down, step forward, repeat. You are completely divorcing yourself from the obsession with the finish line.
And that requires a tremendous amount of trust.
Yeah, I bet.
You have to trust the underlying logic that if you maintain the rhythm of those microactions, the destination will eventually take care of itself. The finish line stops being the focus of your effort and simply becomes a byproduct of your refusal to break the rhythm.
Which provides such an elegant, cohesive journey when we look at the framework as a whole. I mean, this tiny 18-word text takes us through a complete psychological metamorphosis, really, step by step.
It really does.
First, it uses the heavy weight of your past journey as leverage to stop your retreat. You didn't come this far to quit. You anchor yourself to your own sweat equity and literally weaponize your cognitive biases to protect your investment. Then, it defeats the terrifying paralysis of the present by radically shrinking your cognitive scope. One more step, one more try. You bypass the brain's alarm bells by refusing to render the entire map. You only execute the microaction immediately in front of you.
Right, just the 5 feet in front of your character.
Exactly. And finally, it asks you to accept the perpetual nature of the effort. Keep going. It redefines success from achieving a distant victory to simply remaining in a kinetic state of forward motion.
It is a complete, masterfully designed toolkit for survival in high-friction environments. It takes the very murky, unpredictable nature of human motivation and gives it a highly structured, scientifically sound logic.
Yeah.
It proves that endurance isn't about having an endless supply of fuel. It's about managing how your brain regulates the valve.
So, what does this all mean? For you, the listener, navigating your own daily pursuit of learning, building, and pushing past your own boundaries, it means that burnout and cognitive overload are not the end of the road.
Definitely not.
They're not a signal that you lack the capacity to succeed. They're simply software glitches. There are the moments where you need to fundamentally change the lenses through which you're reviewing your work. So stop looking at the miles left to go.
Yeah.
Turn around, look at the miles you've already conquered to secure your anchor, then shrink your horizon down to the space directly in front of your shoe and simply keep your foot moving. That is your only responsibility.
It's an incredibly powerful shift in perspective, and one that completely neutralizes the threat of the unknown. But it leaves us with something deeper and perhaps a bit more philosophical to consider as we wrap up this analysis.
I like where this is going.
If your resolve to persist is fueled entirely by shrinking your world down to the immediate present, by intentionally blinding yourself to the massive goal and focusing purely on taking just one more step over and over again, how does your perception of that final destination change once you finally arrive there, knowing you conquered it purely in fragments?
Wow. When you cross the finish line, having spent the entire journey looking down at the next logical step, does the peak feel different than the grand, shiny reward you originally imagined? Does the value shift from the trophy to the resilience you built along the way? That is a profound thought to sit with the next time you feel like your internal engine has run completely dry. That psychological fuel gauge might say empty, but as we've learned today, your system has reserves that defy your initial calculations. You just have to know how to override the glitch. Keep going.